When my daughter gave me a single wedding invite and said her fiance's family didn't want to meet a simple seamstress, I didn't cry. I'm Myra, 54, an upholstery stitcher from Youngstown. She thought hiding me secured her future. She forgot I know how to unpick a bad seam. My hands are permanently stained with a faint, dark crescent of grease around the cuticles, a souvenir from the gear chains of my 1974 Consu industrial sewing machine. For 30 years, that machine has been the heartbeat of my small basement workshop. It paid for the roof over our heads, the food in our bellies, and every single one of my daughter Chloe's college textbooks. I've stitched heavy canvas, stiff leather, and delicate brocade until my knuckles ached and my eyes burned under the hum of the fluorescent shop light. I never complained. I thought every stitch was a step toward building a better life for my only child. But that afternoon, the air in my workshop felt heavy, thick with the smell of machine oil and the sharp, minty steam of the chamomile tea my assistant Clara had just poured. Clara, who has worked beside me for 15 years and helped me raise Chloe when my husband walked out, was quietly smoothing out a roll of navy blue velvet at the cutting table. Then, the bell above the door chimed, and Chloe walked in. She didn't look like a girl from Youngstown anymore. She wore a pristine, cream-colored trench coat that must have cost more than my weekly grocery budget, and her heels clicked sharply against the concrete floor. She didn't offer a hug. Instead, she laid a small, heavy square of cardstock on the corner of my cutting table, right next to my heavy steel tailoring shears, the ones with the notched brass pivot that my father had given me when I first started my trade. "Mom," Chloe said, her voice tight, avoiding Clara's eyes entirely. "Here's your invitation. It's just for you. No plus ones." I looked down at the elegant embossed gold lettering. The wedding of Chloe Jean Bennett and Julian Arthur Vance. My chest tightened. "Just one, Chloe? What about Clara? She's family. She watched you grow up in this very room." Chloe sighed, a sound full of rehearsed patience. "Mom, please don't make this difficult. It's a very intimate venue. And, well, Julian's family is very traditional. They're old Shaker Heights money. They have certain expectations about the guest list, and Julian is already under a lot of stress." "Old money," I repeated, the words tasting like copper in my mouth. "And what exactly are their expectations, Chloe? That your mother doesn't have friends?" "It's not just that," Chloe said, crossing her arms, her eyes darting to the worn collar of my denim workshirt. "Julian's parents aren't even going to be at the main wedding. They're traveling in Europe for the summer, and we're doing a private, separate dinner for them later. It's just easier this way. If you met them, it would just be uncomfortable. They don't really understand our kind of life. Julian is worried they'll look down on how I grew up. Let's just keep things simple. You have your seat at the ceremony, and that's enough. I know some of you sitting at your kitchen tables right now, looking at your own calloused hands, know exactly how that feels. Have you ever had your own blood look at the work that fed them and see a disease instead of a sacrifice? If you have, you know the quiet, cold ache that starts in your chest and settles deep in your bones. It's a pain that doesn't make you want to scream. It makes you want to get very, very quiet. Clara stopped her shears mid-cut. The silence in the room was deafening, save for the low, rhythmic drip of the leaky pipe in the corner. I looked at my daughter, at the expensive highlights in her hair, the designer handbag slung over her shoulder, and the cold, dismissive tilt of her chin. "I see," I said softly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't beg. "You're ashamed of me." "I'm not ashamed, Mom," Chloe snapped, though her flushed cheeks betrayed her. "I'm just being realistic. I'm marrying into a different world. I need to fit in. I can't have you showing up in your work clothes, talking about fabric yardage and upholstery staplers. Just let me have my day, okay? Don't ruin this for me." She didn't wait for my response. She turned on her high heels and let herself out, the shop bell chiming a cheerful, mocking goodbye in her wake. Clara came over to me immediately, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She reached out, her rough, fabric-worn hand covering mine. "Myra, oh, honey, I am so sorry. She has no right at all." "She's my daughter, Clara," I whispered, staring at the heavy gold lettering on the invitation. "But she's also a stranger. My gut, however, has always been my best tool. In my line of work, if a seam is off by even 1/8 of an inch, The whole cushion buckles. You learn to spot the tension before the thread breaks. And something about Chloe's story didn't sit right with me. Why would Julian's parents, proud old money elites, skip their only son's wedding just to travel to Europe? Why would they agree to a private dinner later instead of standing beside him at the altar? 2 days later, a regular client of mine, a lovely woman named Mrs. Gable, called to ask if I could personally deliver the vintage wingback chair I'd spent 3 weeks restoring. Mrs. Gable lived in Shaker Heights, the very neighborhood Chloe had spoken of with such reverence. I loaded the heavy, velvet-backed chair into the bed of my old, faded blue Ford F-150. As I drove northwest, away from the rusted steel mills of Youngstown and into the leafy, pristine suburbs of Cleveland, my mind raced. I had the address of Julian's parents. Chloe had once left a piece of mail on my kitchen table months ago with their return address on it, and my memory for details has always been sharp. I delivered Mrs. Gable's chair, accepted her generous check, and then, instead of heading back to the highway, I turned my truck down the quiet, tree-lined avenue where the Vance family lived. I expected a sprawling estate. I expected iron gates, manicured lawns, and perhaps a stone fountain in the driveway to match the grand old money persona Chloe had painted for me. Instead, the GPS led me to a modest, slightly run-down split-level house. The white vinyl siding was stained with green algae near the gutters, and the wooden steps leading to the front porch were peeling gray paint. The lawn was overgrown, weeds choking the small flower beds. It looked like the home of someone who was struggling to keep up with the mortgage, let alone someone who spent their summers yachting through the Mediterranean. My heart began to thump against my ribs like a trapped bird. I parked my truck across the street. For a long moment, I just stared at the house. I felt like a trespasser, a foolish mother clutching at straws, but the discrepancy was too massive to ignore. I got out of the truck, adjusted my worn cardigan, and walked up the creaking wooden steps. I knocked. A moment later, the lock clicked, and the heavy oak door swung open. Standing before me was a woman who looked to be in her late 60s. She was seated in a manual wheelchair, her frail shoulders wrapped in a faded pilled blue shawl. Her silver hair was pulled back in a loose, untidy bun, and her face was lined with deep, heavy exhaustion. "Yes? Can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft and trembling. "Hello," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. I'm sorry to bother you. I'm looking for the Vance residence. Is this the home of Julian Vance's parents?" The woman's tired eyes suddenly lit up with a fragile, beautiful warmth. "Oh, yes it is. I'm Helen Vance, Julian's mother. Are you a friend of his? Please come in. It's a bit drafty, but please come inside." I stepped into the narrow hallway. The air inside smelled of stale tea, old paper, and the distinct, damp chill of a house where the furnace isn't run quite enough to keep the cold out. There were no expensive oil paintings on the walls. There were only old, faded family photographs in cheap plastic frames. "Arthur!" Helen called out, her voice echoing down the hall. "Arthur, we have a visitor, a friend of Julian's!" An elderly man with a pronounced limp emerged from the kitchen, wearing a flannel shirt with frayed cuffs. His hands were rough, his fingers thick, the hands of a man who had worked hard labor his entire life. This was Arthur Vance, Julian's father. He looked at me with a mixture of hope and wariness. "We don't get many visitors these days," Arthur said, offering a weak but polite smile. "Are you from the wedding planning company or the bank?" "The bank?" I repeated, my brow furrowing. No, my name is Myra. I'm a friend of the family. I wanted to introduce myself. I heard Julian was getting married." Helen's smile faltered, replaced by a sudden, heartbreaking look of shame. She reached down and clutched the fabric of her shawl. "Oh, the wedding. Yes, our Julian is marrying a lovely girl, Victoria, a wealthy heiress from Chicago. Her family, well, they are very prominent, very private." My breath caught in my throat. "Victoria? They're having the wedding on a private estate in Upper Michigan," Arthur added, his voice heavy with a quiet, bitter grief. "Julian explained it to us. Victoria's family is very exclusive. They didn't want, they felt our presence would make things awkward. Since we can't afford the travel, and with Helen's chair, Julian said it was best if we stayed behind." He said Victoria's father was paying for everything, so they had all the say. Helen's eyes welled with tears. We wanted to go so badly. We mortgaged this house last month to give Julian $50,000 as a wedding gift, so he wouldn't look poor in front of her family. We wanted him to have his head held high. I stood in that cold, drafty hallway, my heart shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces as the horrific truth finally unfurled before me. My daughter Chloe wasn't marrying into a wealthy family that looked down on us. She and Julian had spun a web of mutual monstrous lies. Chloe had told me Julian's parents were snobs who didn't want to meet me, while Julian had told his own disabled sweet parents that Chloe was a wealthy heiress named Victoria, whose family despised them. They had systematically isolated both sides of their families, painting us as the villains to hide their own sickening greed, all while draining this elderly, vulnerable couple of their very last dollar. I looked at Helen's tear-filled eyes, and then my gaze drifted to the small coffee table in the living room. Resting on top of a stack of bills was a glossy, printed business brochure. I took 2 steps forward, my eyes locking onto the cover. There, printed in bold, elegant font, was the name of my own small business, Bennett & Cubber Fine Upholstery Restoration. Underneath, listed as the CEO and CFO, were the names of Chloe Bennett and Julian Vance, alongside a falsified financial ledger claiming my humble workshop was a multi-million-dollar conglomerate. They weren't just lying to keep us apart. They were using my life's work to commit financial fraud, and they were using it to bleed Julian's parents dry. My hand shook as I reached out to touch the glossy paper of the brochure resting on the coffee table. The paper was heavy, the kind of high-grade cardstock that costs a pretty penny to print. On the cover, a high-resolution photograph of a sprawling, sunlit workshop showed a row of pristine, modern sewing machines. It wasn't my basement. It was a stock photo, polished and sterile. But there, embossed in a raised, gold-leaf font at the bottom, was the name, Bennett & Cubber Fine Upholstery Restoration. Underneath, in smaller, elegant lettering, were the titles: Chloe Bennett, Chief Executive Officer; Julian Vance, Chief Financial Officer. I felt a cold trickle of sweat run down the back of my neck. I looked at Helen Vance, who was watching me with a fragile, hopeful expression. Her thin shoulders hunched inside her pilled blue shawl. Beside her, Arthur stood with his hands tucked into the pockets of his frayed flannel shirt, his posture stiff with the defensive pride of a working man who knew his home was falling apart, but refused to apologize for it. Is something wrong, Myra?" Helen asked softly, her voice carrying a tremor that made my chest ache. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I swallowed the lump of hot iron in my throat. I had to force my facial muscles into a pleasant, neutral mask. If I screamed, if I let the rage and horror show on my face, I would break this elderly couple right here in their drafty hallway. They had already mortgaged their home. They had already given away their life savings to a son who was actively erasing them from his life. They couldn't handle the truth yet, not without a safety net. "No, Helen," I lied, my voice remarkably steady despite the storm raging inside me. I'm familiar with this company. In fact, I do some upholstery work myself back in Youngstown. It's a very reputable name. I was just surprised to see it here." Arthur let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Well, that's our Julian's doing. He's a smart boy. Went to business school. Met Victoria. That's your daughter's partner, or rather, the heiress he's marrying. He told us they merged their assets to create this big firm. He said they're opening offices in Chicago and New York. He was so proud. He said our $50,000 was going to help secure the lease on their new flagship showroom." My stomach turned. "Our $50,000. That is a very generous gift, Arthur," I said, my heart bleeding for them. $50,000 is a lot of money. How did you send it to him, if you don't mind me asking? I know these big business accounts can be tricky with transfers." "Oh, Julian set it all up," Helen said, reaching over to pat Arthur's rough hand. "He brought some papers for us to sign. He had a commercial wire transfer form already filled out. It went straight from our local credit union into the Bennett & Cubber corporate treasury account. He said it had to be done quickly to show the commercial landlords they had liquid capital." "I see," I whispered. I kept my eyes on the brochure, but my mind was racing, connecting the dots. "Did Julian happen to leave any of those papers here? the ones with the account details, just because, well, as a fellow business owner, I like to keep track of how these mergers are structured. It's fascinating. Arthur frowned slightly, a flicker of caution in his eyes, but Helen's face was entirely open. "Oh, Arthur, show her the receipt folder. It's in the kitchen drawer. It's nice to talk to someone who understands the business side of things. We've just been praying we did the right thing." Arthur hesitated, then nodded and limped back into the kitchen. While he was gone, I pulled my phone from my cardigan pocket. My hands were trembling so badly I almost dropped it onto the worn linoleum. I opened the camera app and took 3 clear, high-resolution photographs of the brochure: the cover, the fake financial ledger inside, and the back page where a corporate address was listed. The address wasn't in Chicago or New York. It was a P.O. box registered in Boardman, Ohio, just 10 minutes from my own workshop. Arthur returned, holding a blue plastic folder. He opened it and handed me a single sheet of paper. It was a wire transfer confirmation from the Shaker Heights Credit Union. The recipient account was indeed registered under Bennett & Co. LLC, but it wasn't a corporate treasury account. It was a standard commercial checking account, and listed at the bottom of the receipt, under the authorized signers, were 2 names: Chloe J. Bennett and Myra L. Bennett. My breath hitched. My name was on that account. I have never stolen a dime in my life. I have paid my taxes on time every single year since 1991, filing my sole proprietorship returns on a worn wooden desk in the corner of my basement. I had never opened an LLC. I had never authorized a commercial checking account with Julian Vance or my daughter. "Thank you, Arthur," I said, handing the paper back to him. My voice was a whisper, but it was hard as flint. "You've been very helpful. I should get going. I have a long drive back to Youngstown, and the weather looks like it's turning." Helen smiled, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you for stopping by, Myra. It's nice to know people out there appreciate what our Julian is doing. Tell him we love him if you see him. Tell him we're so proud." "I will," I said, and for the first time in my life, the promise felt like a vow of war. I will make sure he gets exactly what he deserves. The drive back to Youngstown was a blur. The sky turned the color of wet slate, and a cold, steady Ohio rain began to beat against the windshield of my old Ford F-150. The rhythmic slap-slap of the wiper blades sounded like a countdown. How could she? The question kept repeating in my mind, a painful, rhythmic thrum. How could the little girl I raised on mac and cheese and hand-me-down coats turn into someone who would steal from a disabled woman and ruin her own mother? I know some of you listening to me right now are shaking your heads. You're thinking, "She's your daughter, Myra. Surely there's a mistake. Surely she was just misled by the boy." But I knew Chloe. I knew the sharp, ambitious edge she'd developed in college. I knew how she looked at my grease-stained fingers. She didn't want to be the daughter of an upholstery stitcher. She wanted to be someone, and she didn't care whose bones she climbed over to get there. When I pulled up to my workshop, the yellow light from the front window was a small, warm beacon in the gray afternoon. I walked inside, the bell chiming above the door. The smell of steam iron, lavender water, and sewing machine oil hit me, a familiar comfort that usually calmed my nerves. Today, it only made me feel fiercely protective. This shop was my life. It was my father's legacy, and it was my sanctuary. Clara was standing by the iron, pressing a piece of gold damask. She took one look at my face and set the iron down on its metal stand. "Myra," she said, her voice dropping. "What happened? You look white as a sheet." "We need to lock the door, Clara," I said, my voice dead and level. "And we need to call Vivian." Vivian was a retired commercial loan officer who lived 3 houses down from me. She was 72, sharp as a tack, and had managed the commercial lending department at the local bank for nearly 30 years. She was also the only person who had helped me navigate the financial paperwork when my ex-husband tried to take the shop during our divorce. She knew the law, and she knew how banks thought. 20 minutes later, the 3 of us were sitting around my worn cutting table. The navy blue velvet I had been working on earlier was pushed aside, replaced by my laptop, Vivian's reading glasses, and a steaming pot of black coffee. Vivian's fingers flew across the keyboard as she accessed the Ohio Secretary of State's business registry. I watched her face, searching for any sign of hope, but her brow only furrowed deeper as she scrolled. "Here it is," Vivian said, tapping the screen with a manicured fingernail. "Bennett & Co. LLC. It was registered 3 months ago. The filing fee was paid with a credit card under Chloe's name. But look at the organizational structure, Myra." She turned the laptop toward me. I leaned in, my eyes scanning the digital document. "They registered it as a manager-managed LLC," Vivian explained, pointing to the fine print. "Chloe is listed as the managing member, but under the section for initial members and guarantors, they've listed you. Your social security number is there, Myra, and your federal tax ID for this workshop." "But I never signed anything," I whispered, my hand clenching the edge of the table until my knuckles turned white. "I didn't even know this existed." "They forged it!" Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Myra! She stole your identity!" "It's worse than that," Vivian said, her voice grave. She pulled up another database, her eyes scanning a credit monitoring portal she still had access to through her professional network. "They didn't just open an LLC. They've applied for a small business expansion loan through regional banks. A big one. $300,000. My heart stopped. 300,000? Yes. And because Bennett & Co. is technically registered using your business tax ID and your 30-year history of perfect credit and steady income, the bank is treating this as an expansion of an already successful, solvent business. They're using your life's work as the collateral, Myra. If that loan is approved, and they default, which they will, because they're using the money to fund a lavish lifestyle and a wedding, the bank won't go after Chloe. They'll come after you. They will seize this shop, this building, and your home." The room spun. The hum of the fluorescent light bulb above us suddenly sounded like a swarm of angry hornets. If you've ever had to look at a legal document with your own name signed by a hand you used to hold when it was tiny, you know the cold that settles in your stomach. It's a physical sickness. It's the realization that the child you would have laid down your life for has looked at your entire existence and decided it was nothing more than a resource to be mined. "The 50,000 from Julian's parents," I said, my voice shaking but gaining strength. "Why did they need that if they were getting a loan?" "They needed it for the down payment and to show good faith liquid assets to the underwriters," Vivian said, looking at me with deep sympathy. "Banks don't just hand out $300,000 without seeing some cash flow in the business account first. Julian's parents' life savings was the bait. They put it in the account to make the business look active and cash-rich so the big loan would clear." I stood up from the table. I walked over to my Kansu sewing machine, my fingers brushing the cold, heavy cast-iron body. I looked at the little notch on the brass pivot of my shears. My father had told me when I was just a girl, "A good tool will never betray you, Myra. People might, but the work you do with your own hands is honest." Chloe had forgotten who taught her how to sew. She had forgotten that I spent 30 years looking at the seams of things, learning exactly how to find the single, structural thread that holds a piece together, and how to pull it so the whole thing unravels. "Vivian," I said, turning back to the table, my voice cold and clear. "How long do we have before that $300,000 loan is approved?" Vivian checked the screen. "The underwriting status says pending final verification. I'd say they have about 10 days, probably scheduled to close right around the time of the wedding." I looked at Clara, who was watching me with fierce, loyal eyes, and then at Vivian, who was already reaching for her blue-lined legal pad. "Then we have 10 days, I said, my voice steady, my heart turning to steel. "We are going to let them think they've won. We are going to let them plan their beautiful, exclusive wedding. But we are going to gather every single piece of paper, every forged signature, and every fraudulent bank transfer. I was going to unpick this seam, thread by thread, and I wouldn't stop until the entire fabric of their lives lay in ruins at their feet." The next morning, the sun didn't so much rise as leak through the gray Ohio sky, casting a cold, watery light across my cutting table. I sat there with a chipped ceramic mug of black coffee, watching the steam rise and disappear into the drafty air of the workshop. On my lap lay the printouts Vivian had run for me. I stared at the signature on the LLC registration. Myra L. Bennett. It was a good forgery. To anyone who didn't know me, it looked perfect. The letters were neat, slanted slightly to the right, but as I traced my finger over the printed line, My heart hollowed out. Chloe had copied my signature from the old checks I used to write her for college rent. But she had missed the tiny, permanent flaw in my hand. In the winter of 1998, I pinched my right index finger in a heavy-duty grommet press. Ever since, my hand has a tiny, almost invisible tremor whenever I finish the letter Y. The Y on this paper was perfectly straight, cold, and calculated. It was a stranger's hand. "You all right, Myra?" Clara asked softly. She was standing by the kettle, her eyes heavy with the same sleeplessness that had kept me tossing and turning until dawn. "I'm all right, Clara," I said, though my voice sounded like dry paper. "I'm just looking at the handwriting of a girl who thinks her mother is too simple to notice when she's being erased. If you've ever had to smile at someone who was actively digging your grave, you know the kind of cold that settles in your belly. It's a quiet, heavy thing. You don't scream. You don't throw things. You just tighten your apron, put your head down, and make sure every single step you take is measured to the millimeter." Just then, my phone buzzed on the wooden table. The screen lit up with Chloe's name. My hand shook slightly as I picked it up, but I cleared my throat and pressed the green button. "Hello, Chloe." "Mom." Her voice came through, fast and impatient, accompanied by the background hum of traffic and a car blinker. "I'm just calling to make sure you got the invitation. And to remind you about the dress. Please tell me you're not planning on sewing something yourself out of some leftover upholstery velvet. I really need you to look presentable. I found a nice, simple gray dress at the department store downtown. I can send you the link. It's very modest." I looked down at the grease stain on my thumb, then at the forged loan documents spread out before me. "I received the invitation, Chloe," I said, my voice steady, betraying nothing. "And don't worry. I'll wear something very quiet. I'll blend right into the background, just like you want." "Good," she sighed, a sound of immense relief. "And remember, if anyone asks about Julian's parents, they're in Paris. They've been planning this European trip for a year, and we didn't want them to cancel it just for a quick ceremony. It's much easier to just keep things simple." Paris. I pictured Helen Vance in her drafty split-level home, her frail shoulders wrapped in that pilled blue shawl, praying for her son's happiness, while her husband limped through the kitchen to find a bank receipt. They weren't in Paris. They were sitting by a space heater in Shaker Heights, $50,000 poorer, believing their son was marrying a wealthy Chicago heiress named Victoria. "Paris," I repeated, the word heavy and cold on my tongue. "How lovely for them. I hope they're getting everything they paid for." "They are," Chloe said, completely missing the edge in my voice. "Anyway, I have to go. Julian and I have a meeting with the bank to finalize some business expansion details before the rehearsal dinner next Friday. I'll see you at the church, Mom. Don't be late." The line went dead. I set the phone down on the cutting table. I closed my eyes and took a deep, shuddering breath. I know some of you sitting at your kitchen tables right now are thinking, "Myra, how could you stay quiet? How could you not scream at her through the phone?" But let me tell you something I've learned from 30 years of restoring ruined furniture. If you pull on a snagged thread too quickly, the whole fabric bunches up and ruins. You have to trace the thread back to its source. You have to find where it's anchored, and you have to cut it cleanly at the root. "She's moving fast," Vivian said, walking into the shop through the back door, carrying her leather briefcase. She set it down on the table with a firm, professional thud. "Buckeye Merchants Bank in Cleveland is processing the loan. The loan officer is a man named Thomas Vance, no relation to Julian, just a coincidence. But he's the senior commercial underwriter. I managed to get in touch with a former colleague of mine who still works in that department." "And?" I asked, leaning forward. "The loan is scheduled for final disbursement next Thursday morning," Vivian said, pulling out a yellow legal pad covered in her neat, precise handwriting. "The day before the rehearsal dinner. They've submitted the forged LLC paperwork, your business tax returns from the last 5 years, which Chloe must have taken from your filing cabinet when she stayed here over Easter, and the $50,000 cash deposit from the Shaker Heights Credit Union as proof of capital. They used Helen and Arthur's life savings to secure a fraudulent loan against my shop," I whispered. The sheer scale of the betrayal felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. They were going to take the money, pay for their lavish wedding, buy their expensive clothes, and leave me and those poor elderly people to drown in the debt. Exactly, Vivian said, her eyes flashing with a cold, professional anger. But because they used your tax ID and forged your signature, the law is entirely on your side. If we go to the police right now, Myra, the loan will be canceled, and Chloe and Julian will be arrested for commercial fraud and identity theft. But, she paused, looking at me gently. But what, Vivian? If we do it that way, the bank will freeze the corporate account immediately, Vivian explained. The $50,000 that Julian's parents deposited, it will be caught in the legal freeze. It could take years for Helen and Arthur to get that money back, if they ever do. And with their mortgage, they don't have years. They'll lose their home before the courts sort this out. I looked over at Clara. She was holding a steam iron, her knuckles white. We can't let those sweet people lose their home, Myra. We just can't. They didn't do anything wrong except love their son too much. No, I said, my voice hardening. They won't lose a single penny. I won't allow it. I stood up and walked over to my desk. I pulled out a fresh sheet of heavy cream-colored ledger paper, the kind I used to draft custom invoices from my high-end clients. I took my vintage fountain pen, the one with the brass nib, and filled it with dark blue ink. Vivian, I said, my hand steady now. How do we stop the loan, protect my shop, and get Helen and Arthur's money back, all at the same time? Vivian smiled, a slow, sharp expression that told me why she had been the most feared commercial loan officer in the county for 3 decades. We let the bank approve the loan, but we don't let them disperse the funds. We file a formal commercial fraud affidavit with Buckeye Merchants Bank's security division. But we request a controlled signing. A controlled signing? I asked. Yes, we let Chloe and Julian walk into the bank on Thursday morning to sign the final loan documents. They will think they've won. They will think the $300,000 is about to hit their account. But instead of a teller handing them a cashier's check, they will be met by the bank's fraud investigators, the regional security director, and us. And the $50,000? Clara asked. We coordinate with the Shaker Heights Credit Union, Vivian said, tapping her legal pad. Once the fraud affidavit is filed, we show that the $50,000 was obtained through fraudulent misrepresentation. Since the funds are currently sitting in the commercial account at Buckeye Merchants, we arrange for an immediate administrative reversal. The money goes straight back to Helen and Arthur's credit union account before Julian can touch a single dime of it. It was a perfect plan. It was clean. It was precise. It was a beautiful, invisible seam that would hold everything together until the moment we pulled the thread. But there's one more thing, I said, looking at the elegant gold wedding invitation still resting on my cutting table. They wanted to exclude us. They wanted to pretend their families didn't exist so they could play act as wealthy elites. I want Helen and Arthur to see who their son really is. And I want Chloe to see that the simple seamstress she was so ashamed of is the one who holds her entire future in her grease-stained hands. What are you thinking, Myra? Vivian asked, her eyebrows rising. The rehearsal dinner, I said softly, a cold smile touching my lips. It's next Friday at that historic manor house in Cleveland Heights. Chloe told me it's an exclusive private event. Just the important guests. I think it's time we showed them what a real family looks like. For the next 6 days, I worked like a woman possessed. During the day, I stitched. I finished a set of heavy gold leaf damask cushions for a historic church restoration project, my Kansu machine roaring like a freight train in the basement. Every stitch was perfect. Every back tack was locked tight. I poured all my grief, all my anger, and all my quiet strength into the work of my hands. But at night, after Clara went home and the shop was quiet, I sat at my desk with Vivian. We compiled the evidence. We gathered 30 years of my business tax records, the forged signature cards, the certified mail receipts, and the bank statements from the Shaker Heights Credit Union that Helen and Arthur had given me. We bound them all together in a heavy black leather folder. I didn't cry. I didn't let myself feel the pain of my daughter's betrayal. Not yet. I had a job to do, and a good tradesperson never lets their feelings ruin the measurement. On Wednesday afternoon, the day before the bank signing, I drove back up to Shaker Heights. The rain had stopped, but the air was still cold and damp, smelling of fallen leaves and wet pavement. I knocked on the door of the split-level house. When Helen opened the door, her face lit up with that same fragile, beautiful warmth. "Myra! Oh, what a wonderful surprise! Come in, come in." "Arthur! Myra is back!" I stepped into the drafty hallway, carrying a thermos of hot soup Clara had made and a small, beautifully wrapped package. Inside the package was a custom-sewn, soft wool lap blanket I had made from the leftover scraps of a high-end cashmere job. It was warm, heavy, and dyed a deep, rich plum color. "I brought you some soup, Helen," I said, helping her wrap the cashmere blanket around her shoulders. "And I wanted to give you this. It's cold in this house, and you deserve to be warm." Helen's eyes welled with tears as she touched the soft fabric. "Oh, Myra, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. You are too good to us. We're so blessed to have met a friend of Julian's." I looked at Arthur, who was standing in the doorway, his eyes shining with a quiet, humble gratitude. "Helen, Arthur," I said, my voice soft, but carrying the weight of a solemn vow. "I need you to trust me. I'm going to take you to a dinner on Friday night. It's a very special dinner, and I want you to wear your best clothes. I will pick you up in my truck, and I will make sure we get there safely." Arthur frowned slightly, his defensive pride flickering. "Myra, we can't afford a fancy dinner. And Julian said Victoria's family—" "You don't have to pay for a thing, Arthur," I said, reaching out to cover his rough, calloused hand with my own. "Just trust me. It's time for you to meet the family you've been kept from. It's time for the truth." They looked at each other, confused, but sensing the absolute, unshakable strength in my voice. Finally, Helen nodded, clutching the plum-colored cashmere blanket to her chest. "We trust you, Myra," she whispered. I smiled, kissed her cheek, and let myself out. As I walked down the creaking wooden steps to my truck, I looked up at the gray Ohio sky. The trap was set. The thread was threaded through the needle, the tension was adjusted, and my hand was steady on the wheel. Tomorrow morning, Chloe and Julian would walk into Buckeye Merchants Bank to sign the papers for their $300,000 dream, and I would be waiting in the shadows, ready to pull the seam. The rain in Cleveland always feels different than the rain in Youngstown. In Youngstown, it washes over the old brick furnaces and the gravel yards, smelling of coal dust and wet iron. In Cleveland, it just makes the tall limestone bank buildings look slick and gray, like expensive, polished gravestones. I sat in the second-floor conference room of Buckeye Merchants Bank, my old canvas handbag resting on my lap. I had worked 30 years to keep my hands clean of debt, and now, here I was, sitting at a table so polished I could see the dark, faint crescents of grease still etched into my cuticles. Vivian sat to my right, her leather briefcase open, documents arranged in neat, overlapping shingles like slate on a roof. Across from us sat Thomas Vance, the head of commercial underwriting, and a tall, quiet man named Mr. Henderson from the bank's security division. "They're downstairs, Myra," Vivian whispered, checking her watch. "The receptionist just buzzed them up." I nodded. My heart wasn't racing. It was beating with a slow, heavy rhythm like the idle of my truck's engine. I reached into my bag and touched the small brass bobbin I had tucked into the pocket, a little weight to keep my fingers grounded. The heavy glass door clicked open. Chloe entered first. She was a vision in a pastel pink tailored suit, her hair bouncing with fresh curls, her face bright with the glow of someone about to inherit the world. Julian was half a step behind her, laughing at something she had said, holding a sleek leather folio. "Thomas, good morning," Julian said, his voice booming with that practiced, easy confidence of a young man who had never had to sweat for $1. "We're ready to get these signatures out of the—" He stopped. The laughter died in his throat. His eyes locked onto me, then darted to Vivian, and finally to the stack of black folders on the table. Chloe froze, her hand hovering over her designer handbag. "Mom? What? What are you doing here?" "Hello, Chloe," I said softly. I didn't get up. I didn't raise my voice. "Hello, Julian." "Is this a joke?" Chloe snapped, her voice rising an octave, her cheeks immediately flushing a bright, guilty crimson. "Mom, you need to leave, right now. This is a private business meeting. We are finalizing a commercial loan." "Actually, Miss Bennett," Mr. Henderson, the security director, spoke up, his voice cool and dry as winter grass. "The meeting is private, but it is no longer about a loan. Please, both of you, sit down." "We don't have time for this," Julian said, his jaw tightening as he tried to maintain his posture. "If this is about some family dispute, we can handle it outside." "Thomas, Can we just get the documents signed? We have a hard deadline with our suppliers." Thomas Vance didn't look up. He simply turned a single sheet of paper toward Julian. It was the commercial fraud affidavit I had signed an hour earlier. "The loan is dead, Julian," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "And so is Bennett & Co." "What did you do?" Chloe gasped, stepping toward the table, her fingernails digging into the leather of her purse. "Mom, what did you do? This is my future. This is our business. You're ruining everything because you're jealous, because you can't stand that I'm leaving Youngstown behind." I looked at my daughter. I looked at the anger in her eyes, the complete lack of remorse, the sheer entitlement dripping from her lips. If you've ever sat in a room where the air suddenly gets so thin you can hear your own heartbeat in your ears, you know what that silence felt like. I know some of you sitting at your kitchen tables right now are wishing I had stood up and screamed. You're wishing I had let the anger take over. But when a seam is dry-rotted, you don't tear at it with your teeth. You let the blade of the seam ripper do the work. You stay quiet, and you let the steel do the cutting. "I didn't ruin your business, Chloe," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room. "Because there is no business. You forged my signature. You stole my federal tax ID. You used my 30 years of honest labor to try and steal $300,000 from this bank." "That's a lie," Julian shouted, his face turning a dark, ugly purple. "We have a partnership agreement. Myra signed it herself in March." Vivian didn't say a word. She simply slid a document across the table. It was the signature card from the LLC registration, enlarged to show the letter Y. "Mr. Vance," Vivian said, addressing the loan officer. "As you can see, the signature on the LLC filing lacks the natural tremor present in all of Mrs. Bennett's legal documents since her hand injury in 1998. Furthermore, we have certified mail receipts proving Mrs. Bennett was in Columbus, Ohio, attending an upholstery trade seminar on the exact day this document was supposedly signed and notarized in Cleveland." Julian's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at the signature, then at Chloe, his eyes wide with a sudden, desperate panic. "But that's not the worst of it," I said, leaning forward, resting my elbows on the table. "You told your parents, Julian, that Chloe was a wealthy Chicago heiress named Victoria. You told them her family was so exclusive they couldn't attend the wedding. And then you took $50,000 of their mortgage money to put into this account to fool the bank." Chloe's head snapped toward Julian. "What? Victoria? What is she talking about?" The look on her face was something I will never forget. The realization that her perfect fiancé had been playing his own game of lies, spinning a web of deceit that mirrored her own. "He didn't tell you, Chloe?" I asked, a cold pity settling in my chest. "He told his disabled mother and his hard-working father that they weren't good enough for your high-society wedding. He took their life savings, and you helped him do it." "Julian?" Chloe whispered, her voice cracking as she looked at him. "Julian, is that true? You told them I was Victoria?" Julian didn't look at her. He was staring at Mr. Henderson. "Look, we can resolve this. It's a family misunderstanding. We can return the $50,000. We just need the expansion capital to—" "The $50,000 has already been returned, Julian," Mr. Henderson said, closing his folder with a sharp, final snap. "Our security division coordinated with the Shaker Heights Credit Union 2 hours ago. The administrative reversal has been executed. The funds are back in Arthur and Helen Vance's account. As for this loan application, it has been flagged as fraudulent. The file is being forwarded to the regional prosecutor's office." The word prosecutor hit the room like a physical blow. Chloe sank into a chair, her pastel pink suit suddenly looking crumpled and cheap. She looked at me, her eyes filling with tears, not of regret, but of absolute, selfish terror. "Mom," she sobbed, reaching across the table, her manicured fingers stretching toward my worn hands. "Mom, please, you can't do this to me. I'm your daughter. They'll arrest us. My life will be over. Please, tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you authorized it." I looked at her hand. I remembered holding that same hand when she was 5 years old, walking her to the school bus in the freezing cold, my own coat thin and worn so she could have the bright yellow one she wanted. I had spent my entire life shielding her from the cold. But you can't shield someone from the harvest of the seeds they chose to plant. "No, Chloe," I said, pulling my hands back and folding them in my lap. I won't lie for you. Not anymore. I've spent 30 years working in the dark so you could walk in the light. But I will not let you drag my honest name into the mud to pay for your vanity. Julian grabbed her arm. His voice hissed and desperate. We have to go. Chloe, shut up. Don't say another word. We're leaving. They stood up, Julian dragging her toward the door. Chloe looked back at me, her face pale, her eyes hollow with a venomous glare. I hate you, she whispered. The words spat across the polished table. You ruined my life. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. Your life isn't ruined, Chloe, I said softly. It's just finally catching up to you. As the heavy glass door swung shut behind them, the silence returned to the conference room. Vivian reached over and placed her hand over mine, her grip tight and steady. You did the right thing, Myra, she said quietly. It's over. No, Vivian, I said, looking out the window at the gray Cleveland rain. It's only half over. They still think they have a wedding dinner tomorrow night. They still think they can hide their shame from the people who love them. I stood up, smoothing the front of my Sunday dress. It's time to go pick up Helen and Arthur. The drive to Shaker Heights was quiet. The rain had slowed to a damp, heavy mist that clung to the trees. When I pulled my old Ford F-150 up to the split-level house, I saw Arthur standing on the porch. He was wearing his best suit, a dark blue polyester blend that was slightly too short in the sleeves, smelling faintly of cedar and mothballs. He had polished his black work shoes until they shone. Inside, Helen was waiting in her wheelchair. She was wearing a simple cream-colored blouse, her silver hair neatly pinned back, and the plum cashmere blanket I had made for her was tucked carefully around her lap. You look beautiful, Helen, I said, kneeling down to adjust the footrests on her chair. We're so excited, Myra, Helen said. Her cheeks flushed with a delicate, youthful pink. Arthur has been polishing his shoes since 5 this morning. We've been praying for this day, to finally meet Julian's new family. They are going to be very surprised to see you, I said, and my voice didn't waver. We loaded Helen's wheelchair into the back of my truck, and I helped Arthur into the passenger seat. The drive to the historic manor house in Cleveland Heights was filled with their quiet, hopeful chatter. They talked about Julian's childhood, about how smart he had always been, and how they had worked extra shifts at the mill just to buy him his first computer. They had given him everything, and he had paid them back by erasing them from his life. When we pulled up the long gravel driveway of the manor, the grandeur of the place was almost suffocating. Sprawling brick walls, towering leaded glass windows, and valets in black vests parking luxury sedans. My faded blue truck stood out like a rusty nail in a velvet cushion. I parked right in the front, ignoring the valet's confused look. I got out, lowered the tailgate, and helped Helen into her chair. Arthur stood beside her, adjusting his tie, his posture stiff with a mixture of awe and pride. Are you ready? I asked, looking at both of them. We're ready, Arthur said, taking Helen's hand. I pushed the wheelchair up the stone ramp and through the massive oak doors of the manor. The sound of clinking crystal and soft classical music drifted from the private dining room at the end of the hall. We walked toward the double doors, and as I pushed them open, the entire room fell dead silent. The dining room of the historic manor house was a sea of glittering crystal, white linen, and towering arrangements of white orchids that smelled sickeningly sweet, like crushed stems and expensive soap. Around the table sat 30 of Julian and Chloe's hand-picked guests, young, polished people in sharp suits and silk dresses, laughing and clinking champagne flutes under the warm glow of the brass chandeliers. At the center of it all stood Chloe. She had changed out of her pink suit into an exquisite backless ivory silk slip dress. Her hair was swept up, exposing the delicate line of her neck and the diamond drop earrings that caught the light every time she tossed her head. Julian stood beside her, his arm draped possessively around her waist, holding a microphone, ready to give a toast. Then, the heavy oak doors groaned open and the room went dead silent. The silence didn't fall all at once. It rippled backward from the entrance, table by table, as heads turned. I pushed Helen's wheelchair into the room, the rubber wheels squeaking softly against the highly polished parquet floor. Beside us, Arthur walked with his pronounced heavy limp, his hand resting on the arm of Helen's chair. his head held as high as his stiff neck would allow. I looked down at the banquet chairs lining the room. My professional eye couldn't help but notice the cheap, synthetic gold brocade slipcovers. The seams at the corners were puckered, the thread tension all wrong, starting to split under the weight of the guests. It was a $10 cover trying to look like a $100 heirloom. It was the perfect backdrop for my daughter's grand illusion. "Julian?" Helen's voice was the first to break the quiet. It wasn't angry. It was thin, trembling, and filled with a confusing, heartbreaking hope. She looked around the opulent room, her eyes wide as they settled on her son. "Julian, sweetheart, is that you?" Julian's face didn't just turn pale. It turned a ghastly, translucent gray, the color of wet river clay. The microphone in his hand emitted a high-pitched, agonizing squeal of feedback as his fingers spasmed around the plastic casing. He lowered his arm slowly, his gaze darting from his mother's wheelchair to Arthur's worn polyester suit, and then to me. Chloe's reaction was different. Her eyes flared with a wild, feral panic. She took a step toward us, her heels clicking like gunshots in the silent room. "Mom, what is this? What are you doing here? And who are these people?" "These people, Chloe," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the soft classical music still playing in the background, "are Helen and Arthur Vance, Julian's parents." A collective gasp murmured through the tables. Julian's friends, the ones who had been told his parents were currently lounging on a private yacht in the French Riviera, looked at one another in stunned confusion. Arthur took a step forward, his black work shoes, which he had polished so lovingly at 5 o'clock that morning, scuffing against the pristine floor. He looked at his son, his rough, thick fingers twitching at his sides. "Julian," Arthur said, his voice deep and gravelly, carrying the heavy weight of a man who had spent 40 years on a factory floor. "Your mother and we came to see you get married. Myra brought us. She said it was time we met your new family." He paused, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the crystal, the silk, the wealthy guests, and finally, Chloe in her ivory dress. "But you told us she was Victoria. You told us her family was exclusive. You told us we weren't allowed to come because we couldn't afford the travel." "Dad, please," Julian hissed, stepping down from the small raised platform, his hands raised in a desperate, pleading gesture. "Not here. Let's go into the hallway. We can talk about this privately. There's been a massive misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding, Julian," I said, stepping forward so I stood directly between him and his parents. I reached into my canvas bag and pulled out the heavy, black leather folder Vivian and I had compiled. I laid it flat on the nearest table, right next to a silver ice bucket. "The only thing that's finished is the lying." Chloe rushed over, her face twisted in a mask of pure rage. "You're crazy! You're ruining my rehearsal dinner because you're a bitter, jealous seamstress who couldn't stand to see her daughter rise above her. Get out of here before I have the security guards throw you into the street." For those of you listening to me right now who have ever been spoken to like you are dirt by the very person you gave your body and soul to raise, I want you to know that in that moment, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel ashamed. I looked at my daughter, and for the first time in her life, I didn't see my little girl. I saw a stranger who had lost her soul in pursuit of a life she couldn't afford. "The security guards won't be throwing anyone out, Chloe," I said, my voice dead and level. "But the bank's fraud division is currently reviewing the loan you and Julian tried to close this morning. The $300,000 commercial expansion loan you applied for using my federal tax ID, my personal credit history, and my forged signature." The room erupted into a flurry of whispers. Chloe's face drained of what little color it had left. She stumbled back a half step, her hand flying to her throat, her diamond earrings swinging wildly. "And as for the $50,000 you took from Helen and Arthur?" I continued, turning my gaze to Julian, whose chest was heaving as if he had just run a marathon. "The $50,000 they mortgaged their home to give you so you wouldn't look poor in front of Chloe's family. That money was returned to their credit union account 2 hours ago. The bank reversed the transfer. You don't have a dime of it, and you never will." You broke the transfer?" Julian whispered, his eyes widening in horror. "But the vendors, the venue deposit, It's all gone, Julian," I said. "The loan is canceled. Your accounts are flagged. The wedding is over. Arthur stood frozen. He looked at his son, and then he looked down at Helen, whose frail shoulders had begun to shake. She was clutching the plum cashmere blanket I had made for her face buried in her hands as she wept, the soft, quiet sound of her heartbreak cutting through the grand room more effectively than any scream. "You took our house money, Julian," Arthur said, his voice breaking, a single heavy tear rolling down his weathered cheek. "We didn't care about the money. We just wanted you to be happy. We wanted you to have your head held high. But you were ashamed of us. You were ashamed of your mother's chair. You were ashamed of my limp." "Dad, no, that's not—" Julian reached out, but Arthur stepped back, pulling Helen's wheelchair with him, shielding her from her own son. "Don't call me Dad," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking with a dignity that made my own eyes sting. "A son doesn't erase his mother. A son doesn't steal the roof from over his parents' heads." Chloe looked around the room. Her friends were already grabbing their coats, whispering furiously, slipping out the side doors to avoid being associated with a public financial scandal. The illusion was shattering, the cheap seams of her perfect life tearing open to reveal the ugly, hollow truth underneath. She turned to me, her eyes wild, tears finally streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "I will never forgive you for this, Mom," she sobbed, her voice a ragged whisper. "Never." "I didn't do this to you, Chloe," I said, looking at her with a heavy, sorrowful peace. "You did this to yourself the moment you decided that my love and the work of my hands wasn't enough for you." I turned the wheelchair around, and together, Arthur, Helen, and I walked out of the historic manor house. We left the glittering crystal, the dying whispers, and the ruined young couple standing in the wreckage of their own greed. A year has passed since that rainy Friday night in Cleveland Heights. The autumn wind is blowing through the streets of Youngstown today, carrying the smell of wet leaves and the distant, familiar hum of the neighborhood. In my basement workshop, the yellow light is warm and bright. The 1974 Consu industrial sewing machine is purring like a happy cat as Clara runs a strip of hunter green leather under the needle. On the small sofa in the corner, Helen Vance sits comfortably, her legs wrapped in the plum cashmere blanket. She's drinking chamomile tea from one of my mismatched ceramic mugs, chatting quietly with Arthur, who is busy using a small hand drill to repair a loose leg on one of my wooden stools. They didn't lose their house. With the $50,000 safely back in their account, they were able to pay off the mortgage and secure Helen's medical expenses. They come down from Shaker Heights every Tuesday now. We've become a family of sorts, not by blood, but by the shared understanding of what it means to survive a storm. Julian and Chloe never had their wedding. The regional prosecutor's office didn't file felony charges. Vivian and I didn't push for prison time, knowing that the public shame and the complete destruction of their credit was punishment enough. But the fallout was absolute. Julian lost his job at the financial firm, and Chloe's high society friends vanished overnight. They are currently living in a tiny rented apartment in Columbus, both working entry-level retail jobs to pay off the legal fees and the debt they accumulated trying to play act as millionaires. Chloe called me last week. It was the first time we had spoken in 12 months. Her voice sounded different over the phone, quieter, tired, stripped of that sharp, ambitious edge that used to make me feel so small. She didn't apologize. Not yet, but she asked if she could come home for Thanksgiving. She asked if she could sit at the kitchen table with me, even if it was just for an hour. I told her yes. I know some of you sitting at your own kitchen tables right now might think I'm being weak. You might think I should have shut the door in her face after what she did. But let me tell you something I've learned from 30 years of restoring ruined things. You don't throw away a beautiful piece of fabric just because it has a tear in it. You unpick the bad stitches. You clean out the old, dry-rotted thread. And then, with a steady hand and a lot of patience, you start to sew it back together, one small, careful stitch at a time. The door is open, but the locks have been changed. Trust is a heavy fabric. It takes a long time to weave, but only a second to rip. I look down at my hands, at the faint, permanent crescent of grease around my cuticles, and I smile. My father was right. The work of your own hands is honest. It sustains you when the world tries to erase you, and it gives you the strength to stand tall when everything else falls apart. Because in the end, love isn't a status symbol. It isn't a line item in a budget, and it certainly isn't something you can forge on a piece of paper. It's a gift, bought with sacrifice, stitched with patience, and held together by the quiet, unbreakable strength of those who know what truly matters.